The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked slowly along the rose-lined pathway. Her small fingers traced the delicate petals of a white rose, her mind elsewhere despite the beauty surrounding her. At 8 years old, she had already learned that being a princess meant living in a world where every step was watched, every smile photographed, and every moment planned by others. Charlotte's governess, Mrs. Henderson, followed at a respectful distance, her keen eyes scanning the surroundings while appearing to focus on her tablet. The security detail was invisible but present, men and women trained to blend into the background while maintaining constant vigilance. It was a Tuesday morning, and the princess was enjoying one of her few unsupervised moments in the garden before her afternoon lessons began. The palace grounds stretched for acres, a green oasis in the heart of London where Charlotte could almost pretend she was just another child playing in a large backyard. Almost, but never quite. The weight of her title followed her everywhere, even at 8 years old. She had inherited her mother's grace and her father's thoughtful nature, but beneath the polished exterior was a child who sometimes wondered what it would be like to simply disappear into a crowd. As she rounded the corner near the old oak tree that had stood on the grounds for over 200 years, Charlotte noticed something unusual. A section of the normally pristine iron fencing that bordered the eastern edge of the property appeared to have been damaged. The ornate bars that usually stood in perfect alignment were bent outward, creating a gap just large enough for a small person to squeeze through. Her curiosity piqued. Charlotte glanced back toward Mrs. Henderson, who was now speaking quietly into her earpiece about the day's schedule. The governess hadn't noticed the damaged fence, and the princess felt a flutter of excitement at discovering something the adults had missed. She approached the opening carefully, her small hands examining the twisted metal. The damage looked recent. There were no signs of rust or weathering on the bent sections. Fresh scratches in the paint gleamed silver against the black iron. Charlotte's heart began to race as she realized that someone had deliberately created this opening. But who would damage palace property? And more importantly, why? Through the gap, she could see a narrow service road that ran behind the palace grounds, used primarily by delivery trucks and maintenance vehicles. It was supposed to be secure, monitored by cameras, and patrolled regularly. Yet here was clear evidence that someone had found a way to compromise the barrier. Charlotte's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it was maintenance workers who had accidentally damaged the fence and hadn't reported it yet. Or maybe it was something more serious, something that would make the adults worried and protective in that way that made her feel both safe and suffocated. She was so absorbed in examining the fence that she didn't notice the figure watching her from across the service road. Hidden behind a maintenance shed, someone had been waiting for exactly this moment, when a young princess would be alone and curious enough to investigate the carefully planned opening. The man had been studying the palace routines for weeks, noting the patterns of the security patrols and the predictable schedule of the royal family. He knew that Charlotte often walked in the garden on Tuesday mornings, and he had noticed her independent streak during the few public appearances she had made. Unlike her younger brother Louis, who stayed close to their parents, Charlotte had a tendency to wander and explore. As Charlotte knelt down to get a better look at the damaged fence, she heard a soft whistle from the other side. She looked up, startled, to see a middle-aged man in a maintenance uniform waving at her from beside the service road. He had a friendly face and a reassuring smile, and he gestured for her to come closer to the fence. "Hello there," he called softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without alerting anyone else. "I'm Tom from the maintenance crew. I was just checking on some repairs we did to the fence. Is everything okay on your side?" Charlotte stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. Her royal training had taught her to be polite to staff members, but something felt off about this encounter. The man wasn't wearing the usual palace maintenance identification, and she had never seen him before. Yet his uniform looked authentic, and he seemed to know about the fence damage. "The fence is broken," she said carefully, staying a few feet back from the opening. "Should I tell someone?" The man's smile widened, and he took a small step closer. "Actually, that's perfect timing. I need to check something on your side of the fence, but I forgot my key card. Could you help me out? It'll just take a minute, and then we can fix this properly." Charlotte hesitated. She had been taught never to help strangers, but this man claimed to work at the palace. If he really was part of the maintenance crew, refusing to help might get him in trouble. It's something in her stomach twisted with unease. "I should probably get Mrs. Henderson," she said, glancing back toward where her governess had been standing. But Mrs. Henderson was no longer visible. She had moved further into the garden while speaking on her phone. "Oh, that's not necessary," the man said quickly, his tone becoming slightly more urgent. "This is just a quick security check. Palace maintenance handles these issues directly. If we involve others, there will be paperwork and delays. You know how these things go." The way he spoke about palace procedures with such familiarity made Charlotte second-guess her instincts. Perhaps he really was a staff member. She had seen dozens of workers around the palace over the years: gardeners, cleaners, technicians. It was impossible to remember them all. "What do you need to check?" she asked, taking one small step closer to the fence. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a small electronic device. "Just need to test the security sensors on this section. The gap triggered an alarm, and we need to make sure it resets properly before we fix the fence. Could you just touch this device to the metal post on your side?" Charlotte looked at the device, which had a small blinking light and appeared technical enough to be legitimate. But as she moved closer to the fence, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The man's shoes were wrong. They were expensive dress shoes, not the work boots that maintenance staff always wore around the palace. Her father had taught her to notice details, especially about people. "Trust your instincts," he had said during one of their private conversations about staying safe. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." Everything about this situation suddenly felt very wrong. Charlotte took a step backward, her heart beginning to pound. "I think I should get someone else to help you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's friendly expression flickered for just a moment, and Charlotte saw something cold flash in his eyes. "Now, Princess," he said, his voice taking on a different tone entirely. "There's no need to make this complicated." The use of her title by this stranger sent ice through Charlotte's veins. Palace maintenance staff were trained to address her as "Your Royal Highness" in formal situations, or simply to speak respectfully without using titles during casual interactions. The way he said "princess" sounded wrong, too familiar and somehow threatening. Charlotte turned to run, but as she did, she saw two more men emerging from behind different sections of the garden's outer buildings. They moved with purpose, positioning themselves to block her paths back to the main palace grounds. These men were not in maintenance uniforms. They wore dark civilian clothing and moved with the controlled precision of people who had planned this moment carefully. Panic flooded through Charlotte's small body as she realized she was being surrounded. The damaged fence hadn't been an accident. It was a trap, and she had walked right into it. Her mind raced through the safety protocol she had been taught, but none of them had prepared her for being cornered in her own garden by people who clearly meant her harm. She looked desperately toward the palace, hoping to see Mrs. Henderson or one of the security guards, but the garden's layout blocked her view of the main building. The old oak tree, which had always seemed like a friendly giant, now felt like an obstacle preventing anyone from seeing her predicament. "Please," she whispered, more to herself than to the men closing in around her. "Please let someone see." The man at the fence was now working at the damaged section, making the opening larger. The metal groaned as he bent it further apart, creating a space big enough for an adult to pass through comfortably. His movements were efficient and practiced. This was not his first time breaching security barriers. Charlotte pressed herself against the trunk of the oak tree, her mind struggling to process the reality of what was happening. This was supposed to be one of the safest places in the world for her. The palace grounds were protected by layers of security that she had always taken for granted. Yet here, she was facing a coordinated threat that had somehow penetrated all those defenses. Her breathing became shallow as the men continued to move closer. She could see now that they were communicating with small hand signals, their coordination indicating extensive planning. This wasn't a random encounter or a crime of opportunity. They had specifically targeted her, planned this moment, and executed it with frightening precision. The realization that someone had spent time watching her, learning her routines, and planning to corner her in this exact spot made Charlotte feel sick with fear. How long had they been watching? How much did they know about her daily life? As the man at the fence finished widening the opening and stepped through onto palace grounds, Charlotte knew that her window for escape was closing rapidly. The other men had positioned themselves to block the main pathways, and now there was a third person inside the secure perimeter. She pressed herself smaller against the tree, hoping against hope that someone would notice her absence and sound an alarm. But she knew that Mrs. Henderson wasn't expecting her back for at least another 15 minutes, and the security patrols followed predictable patterns that these men had clearly studied. Charlotte closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to channel the strength she had seen in her mother during difficult public moments. Even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she knew she had to stay calm and look for any opportunity to get help or get away. When she opened her eyes, the man from the fence was only 20 feet away, his false friendly expression replaced by cold determination. In his hand, she could see something that definitely wasn't a maintenance device. It looked more like a small communication radio. "Time to go, Princess," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made it clear this was not a request. Charlotte's world suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. Everything she had been taught about stranger danger seemed inadequate for this moment when the strangers had come to her, in her safe place, with a plan that had anticipated her every move. As the men closed in, Charlotte's 8-year-old mind grasped the full weight of her situation. She was Princess Charlotte of Wales, third in line to the throne, and someone had just turned her royal status from a privilege into a target. The very title that opened doors and commanded respect had also made her valuable to people with dangerous intentions. Her small hands pressed against the rough bark of the oak tree as she realized that her childhood, that brief, precious time when even royal children could feel safe in their own gardens, was about to end forever. The moment Charlotte pressed herself against the oak tree, her mind shifted from panic to survival mode with a clarity that surprised even her. Years of royal training had taught her to think quickly under pressure, and now those lessons took on a life-or-death importance she had never imagined. As the man from the fence approached, Charlotte noticed something crucial. He kept glancing toward a small maintenance building about 50 yards away. His movements, while deliberate, showed signs of nervousness. This gave her a spark of hope. If he was nervous, it meant the plan wasn't perfect, and imperfect plans had weaknesses. "Listen to me very carefully," the man said as he drew closer, his voice low but commanding. "We're going to walk together toward the service road. If you cooperate, no one gets hurt. If you try to run or scream, things will become much more difficult for everyone." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to focus on details the way her father had taught her during their walks around the palace. The man had a slight accent she couldn't place, and there was a fresh bandage on his left hand. Most importantly, his eyes kept darting to his watch. They were working on a timeline. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended, but steady enough to surprise herself. The man paused, seemingly caught off guard by her question. People probably expected an 8-year-old to cry or freeze with terror, not ask direct questions. "That doesn't matter right now," he said, but his momentary hesitation told Charlotte that maintaining control of the situation wasn't as easy for him as he was pretending. Meanwhile, 50 yards away near the palace's main entrance, Head of Security Marcus Webb was reviewing the morning's patrol reports when his radio crackled to life. "Control to all units. We have a gap in visual contact with Royal One." Royal One was Charlotte's security designation, and A gap in visual contact should never last more than 60 seconds during outdoor activities. Webb immediately activated the palace's comprehensive security protocol. Within moments, every camera on the property was being monitored simultaneously, and all security personnel received silent alerts on their devices. The palace grounds, which moments before had seemed peacefully quiet, suddenly buzzed with invisible activity as trained professionals moved into action. Mrs. Henderson, Charlotte's governess, felt her secure phone vibrate against her hip. The text message was brief but chilling. Royal One. Immediate visual confirmation required. She ended her call instantly and began moving rapidly through the garden, her trained eyes scanning every possible location where Charlotte might have wandered. Back at the oak tree, Charlotte was calculating her options with a precision that would have made her parents proud. The three men had positioned themselves in a loose triangle around her, but their formation had a flaw. They were all focused on preventing her from reaching the palace, leaving the eastern edge of the garden relatively unguarded. More importantly, Charlotte remembered something from her geography lessons with Mrs. Henderson. The eastern section of the garden backed up to a public walking path that was frequently used by joggers and dog walkers. If she could reach that area and make noise, she might attract attention from people outside the palace grounds. "My governess will be looking for me soon," Charlotte said, buying time while she planned. "She always checks on me every 10 minutes. The man's expression tightened. "That's why we need to move now," he said, extending his hand toward her. "Come with me, and this will all be over quickly." Charlotte took a step sideways instead of toward him, testing their reactions. The man to her left moved to block her path, but he was too far away to reach her quickly. The man to her right was older and moved more slowly. If she was going to run, her best chance was to sprint toward the eastern garden boundary and hope she could climb the fence or at least get close enough to the public path to scream for help. In the Palace Security Center, Marcus Webb was coordinating the response with military efficiency. Thermal imaging shows 4 heat signatures in the eastern garden section, reported his technical specialist. 1 small signature against the oak tree, 3 larger ones in surrounding positions. Webb's blood ran cold. For signatures meant someone had breached the perimeter. "Lock down the palace immediately," he ordered. "Alert the Metropolitan Police Counterterrorism Command. And give me a direct line to their Royal Highnesses now." Throughout the palace, steel shutters began closing over windows with barely audible whirs. Staff members received text alerts directing them to secure positions while emergency protocols activated systems that had been designed but never used. Within 2 minutes, one of the most secure buildings in the world had become an impenetrable fortress, but Charlotte was still trapped outside its protection. Prince William was in his private study reviewing documents when his secure phone rang with a tone he had never heard before. The caller ID showed only Palace Emergency. Immediate. "Your Royal Highness." Marcus Webb's voice was controlled but urgent. "We have a developing situation involving Princess Charlotte. She appears to be cornered in the Eastern Garden by unknown individuals who have breached the perimeter." The words hit William like a physical blow. Every parent's worst nightmare was amplified by the unique dangers that came with their family's position. "How many?" he asked, already moving toward the door. "At least 3 individuals. We have visual confirmation via thermal imaging, but direct sight lines are blocked by the garden's layout. Armed response teams are positioning now." William's mind raced through protocols while his heart shattered with fear for his daughter. "I'm coming down. Sir, respectfully, please remain in secure position until we have the situation contained. We cannot risk." "That's my daughter," William said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that ended the discussion. "I'll be in the security center in 60 seconds. Back in the garden, Charlotte was preparing to make her move when she heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of her governess calling her name. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the garden with increasing urgency, and Charlotte realized that the adults had noticed her absence. The effect on her captors was immediate. The man nearest to her cursed under his breath and spoke rapidly into a small radio. "We've lost the element of surprise. Move to extraction point now." Charlotte didn't hesitate. The moment their attention shifted to coordinating their response, she bolted toward the eastern boundary of the garden. Her small legs carried her faster than the men had anticipated, and she had a crucial head start before they realized what was happening. "Stop her!" the leader shouted, abandoning all pretense of stealth. Charlotte ran like she had never run before, her breath burning in her lungs and her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Behind her, she could hear heavy footsteps pursuing her, but she also heard something else: the sound of multiple voices shouting orders and the rapid footsteps of additional people converging on the garden. She reached the eastern fence and immediately began climbing, her small hands finding purchase on the decorative ironwork. The fence was 8 feet tall and topped with decorative spikes, but fear gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Help!" she screamed toward the public path, her voice carrying across the morning air. "Help me! Someone help me!" On the walking path, a jogger heard the desperate cry and looked toward the palace fence. What he saw made him immediately pull out his phone and dial 999. A small girl in expensive clothes clinging to the top of the royal residence's boundary fence while men in the garden below reached up toward her. But Charlotte's grip was weakening, and the decorative spikes at the top of the fence made it impossible to climb over safely. She hung there, 8 feet off the ground, with nowhere to go and her pursuers closing in below. That's when she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the sharp whistle that palace security guards use to signal each other. It was close, very close, and it was answered by another whistle from a different direction. Through the garden came the sound of running feet, but these were different from her pursuers. These moved with the coordinated precision of trained professionals responding to a threat. Charlotte looked down to see her 3 captors suddenly, looking around wildly, their confident formation dissolving into panic. "Armed police! Nobody move!" The voice thundered across the garden with unmistakable authority. From multiple directions, black-clad figures appeared among the trees and flower beds, their weapons trained on the men below Charlotte. The leader of her captors looked up at her hanging from the fence, then at the armed officers surrounding them, and made a calculation. With a gesture to his companions, he raised his hands slowly above his head. "Don't shoot," he called out. "We're surrendering." Charlotte's relief was so overwhelming that her grip on the fence almost failed completely. She hung there, 8 feet above the ground, as the garden filled with security personnel, and the nightmare that had begun with a damaged fence finally came to an end. But even as armed officers moved to secure her captors, Charlotte realized that something had fundamentally changed in her world. The safe bubble of childhood that had protected her even within the constraints of royal life had been permanently shattered. She was still Princess Charlotte, but now she understood in a way no 8-year-old should have to that her title made her a target as well as a treasure. As gentle hands helped her down from the fence, Charlotte looked around at the garden that had been her peaceful refuge just minutes before. It would never feel the same again. The oak tree where she had hidden, the rose bushes she had admired, even the carefully maintained pathways now seemed different, potential hiding spots for threats, blind corners where danger might lurk. Her childhood hadn't ended in that moment, but it had changed forever. And as her father's worried face appeared among the security personnel rushing toward her, Charlotte realized that the fear in his eyes meant that his world had changed too. Being a royal parent meant living with the constant knowledge that their children's safety would always be more complicated than other families could imagine. The men who had cornered her were in custody. The immediate threat was over, but the questions that remained would haunt everyone who loved her. How had this happened? Were there others? And, most terrifyingly, would they try again? The secure medical facility within Kensington Palace had never felt more important than it did in the 30 minutes following Charlotte's rescue. As paramedics checked her vital signs and examined her for any injuries, the full scope of what had just occurred began to sink in for everyone involved. Charlotte sat on the examination table, her legs swinging slightly as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the royal family's personal physician, gently checked her over. Despite the terror she had just experienced, Charlotte appeared remarkably composed on the outside. However, Dr. Mitchell trained, I could see the subtle signs of trauma. The way Charlotte's hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking, how she startled at sudden movements, and the determined way she was trying to appear brave. "You were very clever today," Dr. Mitchell said softly as she checked Charlotte's reflexes. "Climbing that fence took real courage and quick thinking." Charlotte nodded, but didn't speak. The words seemed to be stuck somewhere between her mind and her mouth, as if speaking about what had happened would make it too real to bear. In the adjacent security briefing room, Prince William was receiving a preliminary report from Marcus Webb that painted a chilling picture of how close they had come to disaster. The three men in custody were professionals, not random opportunists or publicity seekers, but individuals with military training and sophisticated surveillance equipment. "The fence damage was created 2 nights ago," Webb explained, his voice tight with the knowledge that they had failed in their primary mission. "They had been monitoring the property for at least 6 weeks, learning the patrol patterns and identifying the blind spots in our camera coverage." Catherine, the Princess of Wales, arrived at the palace within minutes of being notified, her usual composed public demeanor replaced by the raw fear of a mother whose child had been in mortal danger. She moved through the medical facility like a force of nature, her designer clothes and perfect hair incongruous with the panic in her eyes. When she saw Charlotte sitting on the examination table, Catherine's careful royal composure finally cracked. She rushed to her daughter and wrapped her in an embrace that was desperate with relief and love. "Mama," Charlotte whispered, the first word she had spoken since being rescued. And suddenly, the dam of emotion she had been holding back burst open. She began to cry with the intensity of a child who had tried to be brave for too long and could finally let someone else be strong for her. Catherine held her daughter and cried too, not caring who saw her tears or how it might look in any photos that might surface later. In that moment, she wasn't the Princess of Wales. She was simply a mother whose child had nearly been taken from her. William joined them, and for several minutes, the royal family simply held each other while the rest of the world seemed to spin on without them. The weight of their public roles, the demands of duty and protocol, none of it mattered compared to the simple relief that Charlotte was safe in their arms. Dr. Mitchell gave them space while monitoring Charlotte's condition. The princess was physically unharmed, but the psychological impact of such a trauma could manifest in many ways over the coming weeks and months. There would need to be counseling, security briefings, and a complete reevaluation of how they balance Charlotte's need for a normal childhood with the realities of her position. Meanwhile, in interview rooms at New Scotland Yard, counterterrorism specialists were beginning the complex process of extracting information from the captured men. Initial questioning revealed that this was not a kidnapping for ransom in the traditional sense, but something potentially more dangerous, a politically motivated action designed to send a message about the vulnerability of the royal family. The leader, who identified himself only as David Thompson, remained largely silent during initial questioning. However, investigators found sophisticated communication equipment that suggested this was part of a larger network. The possibility that other attempts might be planned sent chills through the security establishment. Commissioner Patricia Hayes of the Metropolitan Police found herself in the uncomfortable position of briefing the Prime Minister about a security failure that could have resulted in an international incident. The fact that unknown individuals had managed to breach the perimeter of one of Britain's most secure locations and corner a member of the royal family raised questions about the effectiveness of current security protocols. "We're treating this as a matter of national security," Commissioner Hayes explained during the emergency briefing. The sophistication of their surveillance and planning suggests resources and training that go beyond typical criminal enterprises. Back at the palace, Charlotte was beginning to process what had happened to her through the lens of an 8-year-old's understanding of the world. As the immediate shock wore off, she found herself asking questions that revealed both her intelligence and her struggle to comprehend the adult complexities of her situation. "Why did they want to take me?" she asked her parents as they sat together in her private sitting room. "I didn't do anything wrong." William and Catherine exchanged looks over their daughter's head, both struggling with how to explain concepts like political terrorism and symbolic violence to a child who should have been thinking about homework and playdates instead. "Sometimes," William said carefully, "there are people who are angry about things that have nothing to do with you personally, but they think that by hurting people in our family, they can change things they don't like about the world." Charlotte considered this with the seriousness of a much older child. "But that doesn't make sense. Hurting me wouldn't change anything important." "No, sweetheart, it doesn't make sense," Catherine agreed. "But sometimes people do things that don't make sense when they're very angry or confused about how the world works." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mrs. Henderson entered, her face showing the strain of knowing that Charlotte had been in danger while under her care. The governess had been Charlotte's constant companion for 3 years, and the thought that she had failed in her most basic duty, keeping the princess safe, was devastating. "Your Royal Highnesses," Mrs. Henderson said formally, then looked directly at Charlotte. "I'm so very sorry. I should have been watching more carefully." Charlotte surprised everyone by getting up and going to her governess. "It wasn't your fault," she said with a maturity that broke her parents' hearts. "They planned it for a long time. You couldn't have known." Mrs. Henderson knelt down to Charlotte's level, tears in her eyes. "You were very brave today, braver than many adults would have been in your situation." As evening approached, the palace settled into an uneasy quiet. Additional security measures had been implemented, but everyone knew that the fundamental assumptions about royal safety had been challenged. The idea that the palace grounds represented an impenetrable sanctuary had been shattered, and rebuilding that sense of security would take time and significant changes. Charlotte's brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis, had been kept largely unaware of the specific details of what had happened, but they could sense the tension in the household. The family dinner that evening was subdued, with everyone trying to maintain normalcy while processing the reality that their world had changed. During her bedtime routine, Charlotte asked her mother a question that revealed how deeply the day's events had affected her understanding of her own identity. "Mama, do I have to be a princess if it makes bad people want to hurt me?" Catherine sat on the edge of Charlotte's bed, choosing her words carefully. "Being a princess isn't something you can choose not to be, darling. It's part of who you are. But it's not the only part of who you are, and it doesn't define your whole life. The man called me princess, but he said it like it was a bad thing. Some people see our title as representing things they don't like about the world," Catherine explained. "But for every person who might want to use our position for wrong reasons, there are thousands more who appreciate what our family tries to do to help people and serve our country." Charlotte nodded slowly, but Catherine could see that her daughter was still struggling with concepts that were difficult even for adults to understand. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her very existence is both a privilege and a target? How do you help a child understand that the same title that opens doors and commands respect also makes her valuable to people with dangerous intentions? As Charlotte finally drifted off to sleep, exhaustion overcoming the adrenaline that had sustained her through the day, her parents stood in the doorway, watching her peaceful face. In sleep, she looked exactly like what she was, a little girl who should have been worried about nothing more serious than spelling tests and whether her friends would like her new dress. William and Catherine knew that they faced difficult decisions in the coming days. Charlotte's security would need to be dramatically increased, but they had always been committed to giving their children as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of their positions. Finding the right balance between safety and normalcy would be one of the greatest challenges of their parenting. More immediately, they had to prepare for the media storm that would inevitably follow once news of the incident became public. The palace's communications team was already working on statements and strategies, but controlling the narrative around a threat to a child member of the royal family would be nearly impossible. In secure facilities across London, Intelligence analysts were working through the night to understand the broader implications of the attack. The men in custody represented a new type of threat to the royal family, one that combined political motivation with professional planning and execution. The possibility of copycat attempts or related plots required immediate attention from multiple agencies. Charlotte's rescue had been successful, but everyone involved understood that they had been fortunate. The attack had been well planned and could easily have resulted in tragedy if not for Charlotte's quick thinking and the rapid response of the security teams. As the night wore on and the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, one thing was clear: life for the royal family would never quite be the same. The events of that Tuesday morning had reminded everyone, in the most visceral way possible, that the price of public service could include dangers that no family should have to face. But they had also demonstrated something important about Charlotte herself. At 8 years old, she had shown courage, intelligence, and resilience that suggested she would be able to handle the unique challenges of her position. The same qualities that had helped her survive the attack would serve her well in the years to come as she grew into her role as a future leader. The little girl sleeping peacefully in her bed was still a princess, but she was also something more, a survivor who had looked danger in the face and found the strength to fight back. 6 months after the garden incident, Princess Charlotte stood in the same spot where she had once been cornered, but everything about the experience was different now. The oak tree remained unchanged, its ancient branches still reaching toward the sky with the same quiet dignity it had possessed for centuries. But Charlotte herself had been transformed by that terrifying morning in ways both visible and hidden. The eastern section of the palace garden had been completely redesigned following extensive security reviews. The iron fence now stood 12 feet tall instead of 8, with additional barriers and sophisticated sensors embedded throughout its structure. Multiple camera angles covered every inch of the area that had once been a blind spot, and security patrols now followed randomized patterns that made surveillance and planning nearly impossible for potential threats. Charlotte walked the familiar path with her new security detail, a carefully selected team that included specialist officers trained specifically in protecting child members of the royal family. The days of Mrs. Henderson providing oversight while security remained invisible were over. Charlotte's protection now included constant visual contact with trained professionals who understood that her safety required vigilance that went far beyond what had previously been considered adequate. Dr. Eleanor Ashford, a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, had become a regular presence in Charlotte's life. Their weekly sessions had helped Charlotte process the emotional impact of her ordeal, but they had also revealed the complex ways in which the incident had accelerated her understanding of her position and its implications. "How do you feel about being back in this part of the garden?" Dr. Ashford asked as they sat together on a new bench positioned to provide clear sight lines in all directions. Charlotte considered the question with a thoughtfulness that had become characteristic of her demeanor since the incident. "It feels different," she said finally. "Not bad different, just more aware different. I noticed things I never noticed before." It was true. Charlotte's perception of her environment had been forever altered by those frightening minutes when she had been forced to think strategically about escape routes and potential hiding places. She now automatically assessed every new location for security features and potential vulnerabilities. This awareness was both a protective mechanism and a burden for a child who was not yet 9 years old. The investigation into the attempted kidnapping had revealed a complex network of individuals with various motivations for targeting the royal family. David Thompson, the leader of the group that had cornered Charlotte, had connections to anti-monarchist organizations across Europe. The plan had been to use Charlotte as leverage in demanding policy changes related to government, spending on royal security, and ceremonial functions. Detective Chief Inspector Maria Santos, who had led the investigation, found herself deeply troubled by the sophistication of the planning involved. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion, she explained to the Security Review Committee. These individuals had resources, training, and detailed intelligence about palace operations. We're looking at a threat level that requires us to fundamentally reconsider how we approach royal protection. The arrests had led to the discovery of similar surveillance activities around other royal residences. A coordinated effort had been underway to identify vulnerabilities across multiple properties, suggesting that Charlotte's cornering had been intended as the first in a series of escalating incidents designed to demonstrate the royal family's vulnerability. For Charlotte's parents, the months following the incident had been a delicate balance between increased security measures and their determination to preserve some semblance of normal childhood experiences for their daughter. Prince William had insisted on personally reviewing every aspect of Charlotte's new security protocols, while Catherine had focused on helping Charlotte maintain her confidence and independence despite the traumatic experience she had endured. The hardest part, Catherine confided to her private secretary during one of their weekly briefings, is watching her process the realization that her very existence makes her a target. No child should have to think about why strangers might want to hurt them simply because of who their family is. Charlotte's relationship with public appearances had evolved significantly following the garden incident, where she had once approached royal engagements with natural curiosity and enjoyment. She now displayed a more cautious awareness of crowds and unfamiliar faces. Her security team had worked extensively with Dr. Ashford to develop strategies that would allow Charlotte to fulfill her royal duties without compromising her emotional well-being. The changes were particularly evident during Charlotte's first major public appearance after the incident, the annual Children's Garden Party at Buckingham Palace. As hundreds of children and their families gathered on the palace grounds, Charlotte moved through the event with a poise that impressed observers but concerned her parents. She's scanning the crowd, William noted quietly to Catherine as they watched Charlotte interact with young guests. She's looking for threats instead of just enjoying the experience. It was a sobering reminder that the price of Charlotte's survival had been the permanent loss of the innocent trust that had characterized her early childhood. The little girl who had once wandered freely through palace gardens now approached every new situation with a strategic awareness that was both protective and heartbreaking. Mrs. Henderson had requested a transfer following the incident, feeling that her inability to prevent Charlotte's endangerment represented a fundamental failure in her duties. However, Charlotte herself had advocated for her governess to remain, demonstrating a maturity and understanding of adult emotions that surprised everyone. Mrs. Henderson taught me to notice details and think about things carefully, Charlotte had explained to her parents. That's what helped me when the bad men came. I don't want her to leave because she taught me things that kept me safe. The conversation had led to Mrs. Henderson remaining in her position, but with modified responsibilities that reflected the new security realities. Her role now included coordination with Charlotte's protection team and specialized training in threat recognition and response procedures. As Charlotte's 9th birthday approached, her parents found themselves grappling with questions about how to celebrate the milestone. The traditional approach would include public appearances and media coverage, but the security assessment recommended limiting Charlotte's exposure until the investigation into potential additional threats was complete. Charlotte herself had developed strong opinions about her birthday celebrations that reflected her changed perspective on public life. I want to have a party, she told her parents during a family discussion. But I want to invite the police officers who helped catch the men who tried to take me. They should be part of celebrating that I'm safe. The request led to one of the most unique royal birthday celebrations in recent memory. Detective Chief Inspector Santos, the armed response officers who had surrounded Charlotte's captors, and the technical specialist who had tracked the threat through thermal imaging were all invited to a private celebration at Kensington Palace. During the party, Charlotte presented each officer with a handwritten thank you note that demonstrated both her gratitude and her sophisticated understanding of what they had done for her. "Thank you for making sure I could have more birthdays," read one note, capturing in simple language the life-or-death nature of their intervention. The investigation had also revealed positive developments that helped restore some confidence in the security systems protecting the royal family. The rapid response to Charlotte's disappearance had demonstrated that palace security protocols, while not perfect, were capable of coordinating an effective rescue operation under extreme pressure. Marcus Webb, who had overseen the security response, received recognition for his leadership during the crisis, but he remained focused on the systematic improvements necessary to prevent similar incidents. "We were fortunate that Princess Charlotte kept her composure and made smart decisions," he acknowledged. "Our systems worked, but they relied too heavily on luck. We've implemented changes that eliminate those dependencies." Charlotte's return to school in September brought new challenges and adjustments. Her classmates were largely unaware of the specific details of what had happened during the summer, but Charlotte's teachers had been briefed on potential signs of trauma and strategies for supporting her academic and social development. The most significant change was Charlotte's relationship with privacy and public attention. Media coverage of royal children had always been carefully managed, but the attempted kidnapping led to even stricter controls on information about Charlotte's activities and whereabouts. Photographers who had once been permitted to capture candid moments of royal children at public events now operated under severe restrictions designed to prevent potential threats from gaining intelligence about security arrangements. For Charlotte, this increased privacy came with the understanding that her life would always be different from those of her classmates. The friends she made at school would need security clearances for visits to royal residences. Her participation in normal childhood activities like birthday parties and school trips required advanced coordination with protection officers. Dr. Ashford's ongoing work with Charlotte revealed a young girl who was successfully processing her trauma while developing remarkable resilience and emotional intelligence. Charlotte has an unusual ability to understand complex adult concepts while maintaining her essential childhood nature, Dr. Ashford reported to her parents. "She's not growing up too fast. She's simply developing the tools she needs to navigate her unique circumstances." As the first anniversary of the garden incident approached, Charlotte made a request that surprised her parents and demonstrated how thoroughly she had integrated the experience into her understanding of her royal role. "I want to write a letter," she told them during one of their regular family meetings, "to other children who might be scared because bad things happen to them. To tell them that being scared is okay, but being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave too." The letter, which would eventually be shared with children's charities and support organizations, reflected Charlotte's emerging sense of purpose and her desire to use her experience to help others. Her words carried a wisdom that transcended her years while maintaining the authentic voice of a child who had faced real danger and survived. Standing in the garden on that 6-month anniversary, Charlotte looked around at the familiar landscape with eyes that had been forever changed by experience. The roses still bloomed with the same beauty, the pathways still led to the same destinations, and the ancient oak tree still provided the same shade it had offered for generations. But Charlotte herself was different now, stronger, more aware, and paradoxically both more vulnerable and more resilient than the 8-year-old who had once wandered these paths in innocent curiosity. She had learned lessons about courage, survival, and the complex realities of her position that would serve her throughout her life as a future leader. The little girl who had climbed desperately up an iron fence while crying for help had become a young princess who understood that safety came not from the absence of danger, but from the presence of people committed to protecting what mattered most. And in that understanding, she had found a foundation for facing whatever challenges her unique life might bring. As she walked back toward the palace with her security detail, maintaining their careful watch, Charlotte carried herself with a quiet confidence that spoke of hard-won wisdom. The garden incident had taken something precious from her, the innocent assumption that the world was inherently safe for those she loved. But it had also given her something valuable in return, the knowledge that even in the face of real danger, she possessed the courage and intelligence to survive. Princess Charlotte had learned, At an age when most children worry only about playground disputes and homework assignments, that being royal meant accepting both extraordinary privileges and extraordinary risks. But she had also discovered that with the right support, even the most frightening challenges could be overcome. The 8-year-old who had been cornered in a palace garden had grown into a 9-year-old who understood that true security came not from walls and cameras, but from the courage to face whatever came next with dignity, intelligence, and the unwavering support of people who would never stop fighting to keep her safe.